Chapter 2 Inaugurations and Interventions. January 20th, 2005. The United States Capitol, Washington, District of Columbia. Winter in Washington isn't all that different from winter back home. Cold wind, short days, and that weak sunlight that makes fresh snow sparkle in a way kids like me always found magical. Sadly, on my first day in the nation's capital, I only got to be outside for a few hours. I spent that time either being bored out of my mind or having a strange experience that wouldn't make sense until I was much, much older. The boredom happened first. The presidential inauguration is a monumentally important event that children really have no place in. There's a long list of traditions and ceremonies that need to be carried out before a new US president can take office. Now, I'm fully aware of the fact that less than 1/10 of the people who read my previous book were Americans, and that non-humans make up a measurable fraction of the remainder. I'll try to keep my explanations of American government systems simple. My family showed up in the District of Columbia before the sun came up on the 20th of January. Jackie and I were tired. We threw about 2.5 months worth of temper tantrums before this point. Basically, we refused to leave our home in Detroit and put up one hell of a fight. Our parents eventually dislodged us by a combination of bribery, threats of punishment, and the stern reminder that we were in fact children and we couldn't choose where to live. By January, we just kind of gave up and said reluctant goodbyes to our friends. We gave one another those emotional hugs and promises to keep in touch, a kind of promise that a kid makes when they know they're about to be permanently separated from a friend and lose touch anyway. Our first stop was the US Capitol in the District of Columbia. I remember learning about this place in school, but textbooks really don't do it justice. Jackie and I were dressed in our absolute best, and our mom didn't wait for her term as First Lady to start before she began dressing like one. The new First Family, that's us, and about 200 US lawmakers were gathered together in the Senate chamber, along with several members of the Supreme Court. Waiting for us in the room was the outgoing Vice President, June Sayers. She's an absolutely ancient black woman who could have been my grandmother's mother. She was physically crippled and unable to get out of her wheelchair. During the 2004 election, Sayers ran for a second term along with President White. When my dad defeated White, Sayers went down with him. So now, my dad's running mate was here to take her job. Trevor McDonald shook hands with the Vice President and greeted her warmly. Vice President Sayers laughed and said, "Come here, son," as she drew him into a hug. Congressmen applauded while the Speaker of the House of Representatives held up a small black book and addressed McDonald. "Place your right hand here and repeat after me. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter." When he was finished, Vice President McDonald shook hands with his predecessor again. Then Mrs. Sayers, who was just an ordinary citizen now, skillfully maneuvered her wheelchair down the hallway and shook hands with my dad. "Are you ready, young man? It's time." My dad fell in step behind Mrs. Sayers. The Robinson family followed him, and the members of Congress followed behind us. We left the Capitol building through a large doorway and came upon a sight that took my breath away. A platform was built along the western entrance of the Capitol, facing out towards the National Mall, a wide, grassy park. I could see the Washington Monument in the distance, but that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the people. Later on, I found out that there were some 300,000 Americans crammed into the National Mall. But in that moment, if you told 11-year-old Blake that there were 1 million people out there, he definitely would have believed you. The inauguration stage was packed with important people. A former president was here as well. George H.W. Bush was bundled up in a heavy coat to keep the cold air away. They were accompanied by hundreds of prominent American politicians and business people, as well as guests from all over the world. In the middle of it all, there was a podium that overlooked the National Mall. The perfect thing for giving a speech to the American people. There were 2 people standing next to it, waiting for my dad. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and President George White. The outgoing leader of America looked just as tired and worn out as Jackie and I. As we took our seats, we couldn't help but feel like the one thing President White really needed was a soft chair and some time to nap. My dad shook hands with both men, and then the big moment came. I, Joshua Dennis Robinson, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Dad's oath was much shorter than Trevor's. I don't remember why. What I do remember is that as soon as my dad became president, George White handed him a simple gray briefcase. The 2 shook hands one more time, and then my dad turned to give a speech. He talked for about 20 minutes. Dad thanked everyone who voted for him and offered some kind words for those who had voted against him. Then he discussed his plan to strengthen America's defenses against terrorism, as well as his goals for the economy. Finally, Dad's speech ended with a direct message of support for the American soldiers who fought in the Afghan war. This is the start of something new, my dad finished. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but now we've taken the all-important first step. Let's bring our country forward into the new millennium together. The crowd wouldn't stop cheering and clapping for 3 full minutes. After the inauguration, there was a parade. Soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen marched past the Capitol in formation, while famous political groups like the League of Women Voters and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People passed out patriotic balloons to children in the crowd. After that came the luncheon. I'd never heard that word beforehand, and it left a very negative impression on me. Basically, we sat down in a big fancy dining hall with a bunch of rich and powerful Americans who spent an hour singing praises for my dad while we all snacked on food that wasn't filling. About half an hour into the luncheon, I looked around for anything interesting. I was trying to find something to alleviate my rapidly growing sense of boredom. A few more minutes in this stuffy room with uninteresting adults would have driven me insane. I leaned over to talk to my sister. "Hey, Jax," I hissed. "You bored?" "I'm bored." "No way," Jackie whispered back. "I'm waiting for Dad to find out. I want to see the look on his face." "Find out what?" I asked in a low voice. "That old guy gave our dad a present on the stage," Jackie whispered. "Dad left it up there. He doesn't know we left it behind. I'll bet he pops a fuse when he sees it's gone." Jackie squirmed in her chair with excitement. This gave me an idea. I wanted to take this a little further. I was still a kid, and my thought process back then was, shall we say, irrational. "Maybe we can get back at Dad for forcing us to move out here," I whispered. "If we get that gift first, we can hide it for a few days. Maybe forever." Jackie nodded quickly. "You know where it is?" she asked. "Right by the tall thing with the microphones." I nodded. "Just like the school choir show last year," I said. "Same plan." Without waiting for me to say anything else, Jackie got down from her chair and ran around Mom's back. This plan worked a few times before, and I saw no reason for it to fail now. Dad! Dad! Jackie cried, fake tears welling up in her eyes. This big guy asked me why my skin's a funny color. She pointed towards the Senate Majority Leader, who was busy talking to someone else and didn't realize he'd been accused of anything until my dad, the president, stood up and started closing the distance on him. Whatever happened next, I didn't see. As all eyes were on my dad, nobody noticed me slip out of the room. At least, that's what I thought. You could say I had tunnel vision. I was so focused on my plan to get some passive-aggressive payback that I didn't look in any direction other than forward. I remembered the path we took through the Capitol building to reach the luncheon, and I retraced my steps quickly. Down one corridor and up a stairwell, I was out in the next hallway when the gentle ding of an elevator door caught my ears. I looked around. Someone was following me through the Capitol building. An Irish-American woman with dull, reddish-gray hair was tailing me at a distance. She wore a simple white blouse underneath a heavy winter coat and a ball cap that said in white letters, Secret Service, U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Oh, I remember the feeling of terror that washed over me when I realized exactly who this person was. My sister and I were warned about the Secret Service by Trevor before he was sworn in. Before being elected, Mr. McDonald was the leader of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the preeminent law enforcement agency in America. He told me that the Secret Service were a force unto themselves and not to be messed with. So, instinctively, I did the thing I'm sure plenty of kids would have done if they were in my position. I shouted to the Secret Service agent, "Buzz off and leave me alone." I turned around and started walking towards the inauguration stage again. I could see from a map on the wall that I still needed to climb 2 more sets of stairs and cross over to the other side of the building. Quite a ways to go. Then, there was the thudding of rapid footsteps behind me. I knew the agent was jogging to catch up with me, and I started to run down the hallway for the next elevator, but it was no use. The agent was a fully grown woman, and I was just a kid. I didn't get more than a dozen paces before the woman grabbed me by the arm and said, "Just where do you think you're going, lad?" The agent spoke in an Irish accent that was so intense I had to strain my ears just to understand what she was saying. "First family's got to stay together after finishing the lunch." "Get off me!" I pulled against her arm as hard as I could. Back in 2005, colored children like me knew to avoid interacting with law enforcement wherever possible, and I just assumed the Secret Service were some kind of super cops. "I really don't think so, lad," the agent replied. "You're not to be wandering off by yourself. What are you even doing down here anyway?" Realizing I wasn't going to get far with this lady grabbing onto me, I stopped struggling and thought of my next actions. I quickly planned out an escape. I would tell a half-truth, just enough to let me get out of her sight, then resume my ploy to make Dad feel bad for moving the family away from Michigan. "My dad left something on the stage," I said. "I told him I'd get it and bring it back. If you don't let me go, you're going to get in trouble with him." The agent laughed. "Oh, really now?" she replied. "Now why don't you tell me what your daddy left behind, and maybe I'll help you get it back." "A briefcase," I answered. "That gray thing Mr. White gave him just before Dad gave his speech." As best I can remember, it all happened in about 3 seconds. In that first moment, the agent grabbed me around the middle and lifted me over her shoulder, springing into a run at the same time. I shouted and hit her on the back with my fists, but it was no good. In the second moment, the agent carried me into an empty office, dropped me unceremoniously on a desktop, and then slammed the door behind her. In that last moment, the agent drew 2 objects from her winter coat. The first was one of those large walkie-talkies made famous by the E.T. movie. The other object was, "Jesus Christ!" I screamed. "Is that a gun?" The agent pressed herself against the office doorway, holding it closed. She pointed her gun at the floor and talked into her radio. "Nick's calling all units on this net," she shouted. "This is Nix calling everyone! Fumble! Say again! Fumble on the play! Live ball at the goal line!" The office had no windows, but I could hear the wail of a police siren, followed by the squealing of tires. The agent called Nix, uttered the one curse word my mom said she would kill me for using, then looked over at me. "You did right saying something, lad," she said. "This could end really badly. Just wait." Meanwhile, something curious was happening about half a mile away. It had taken nearly an hour for all of the people attending the inauguration to clear out of the National Mall. Capitol police officers generally did their best to keep order, and the whole day was looking like it would end in a peaceful manner. But as the great mess of people filtered away, there were 3 individuals who did not leave the premises. 2 of them stood together, staring at the nation's capital through binoculars. For the past 70 years, the names of these 2 individuals were unknown. But thanks to the declassified documents Igarashi gave me, I can now reveal with 100% confidence that these 2 people were agents of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In 2005, the USSR, sometimes called the Soviet Union, was a dying empire on its last legs. The Soviet Union, largest nation on Earth, was in the middle of a decline that spanned decades. Most of their foreign allies had either fallen to revolution or defected over to the American side of the Cold War. By the time my dad became president of the U.S., the Soviet Union stood alone as what my dad called America's final enemy. The only thing that held the USSR together these days was a string of highly improbable military triumphs and victories that can only be described as miracles or acts of God. Rafal Kowalski and Ivan Kuznetsov were both members of the Soviet Red Army and were personally selected for this mission by some of the highest-ranking members of the Communist Party. Even still, they couldn't believe their luck. Rafal looked around for cops and security guards, while Ivan peered through his binoculars at the podium where President Robinson gave his inaugural address mere hours ago. The president's nuclear briefcase was lying unattended by the podium, in the open, where anyone could snatch it. "It's still there," Ivan breathed. "How could they have left it in the open so foolishly?" "They've clearly made a mistake," Rafal said. "We may not get such an opportunity again." Ivan put his binoculars away. "Can you imagine what the KGB would do with a briefcase full of America's nuclear secrets? It will be an intelligence coup de grace." "Don't count your chickens before they hatch, comrade," Rafal warned his friend. "We must secure the case first, and—" He trailed off. Rafal tapped Ivan on the shoulder. "To your left," Rafal said in a low voice. 500 meters. That girl was watching us." "Oh, can you be sure?" Ivan squinted to get a better look. "It looks like she's running towards a car." On the other side of the National Mall, 2 DC cops sat down in their car and let out a long, contented sigh. The radios squawked, and a voice spoke up. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Chief of Police. That might have been the best inauguration we've ever done. No injuries or arrests. Extra coffee for you all when we get back to the precinct." "I'll drink to that," the senior cop declared from the driver's seat. "Maybe the chief will give us the day off tomorrow," suggested his partner. "God knows we need the rest." The senior officer looked up from the car's dashboard and groaned. "Oh, wake up, buddy. This girl looks like she's in trouble." Both cops clambered out of their car just as a girl ran up to them at full speed. Unfortunately, there is no surviving dashcam footage of what happened next. However, the junior cop, a man named Kevin Zimmerman, lived a further 60 years after these events, and he formally testified to the UN Truth and Reconciliation Commission about what happened next. This next section is a recreation of that testimony. An Asian American girl, roughly 17 or 18 years of age, ran toward the police car, waving her arms to get the officer's attention. "All right, ma'am," said Officer Zimmerman. "What's the problem?" I saw a thing," the girl gasped, panting from the effort of running. "Someone left a package by the podium and never came back for it. You guys need to call the bomb squad." She pointed toward the podium. With half a century of hindsight, we know full well that she was talking about the nuclear briefcase. In that moment, Officer Zimmerman was the type of cop who took a bomb threat very seriously. He immediately picked up his radio and called it in. Meanwhile, Zimmerman's partner was looking over the girl's shoulder and spotted two men making their way towards the strange gray rectangle leaning against the presidential podium. The officer quickly crossed the street and shouted, "You there! Stop!" Ivan Kuznetsov and Rafal Kowalski froze in their tracks, and for just a moment they looked at the cop coming their way. And then they both turned around and ran, heading south towards Arlington. Zimmerman's partner gave chase, running fast after the two suspects. Zimmerman turned to the girl and said, "Stay here, talk to them." He pointed to another DC police car that was pulling up next to them on the side of the road. As two more cops arrived on the scene, Zimmerman went chasing after the suspects, determined to help his partner however possible. Unfortunately, both men escaped from the police and vanished without a trace. The situation was made even worse when Zimmerman returned to the scene 10 minutes later to find the Secret Service were all over the place, detaining and interrogating everybody in a 1,000-foot radius of the presidential podium. Why were the Secret Service doing this? The briefcase sitting on the presidential podium was no ordinary case. It was the nuclear football, a device the American leader used to issue commands to military forces armed with nuclear weapons. The girl who reported the suspicious package ran away as soon as Zimmerman turned his back. She was missing too. Thanks to the evidence provided by Nobukazu Igarashi, we realized that there was no way to doubt the following conclusion. This mysterious girl who ran away was Akira Robinson, the paradox who tampered with the destiny of the whole galaxy. What might have happened if the Russians made off with the nuclear football and its contents? Thanks to the paradox, we'll never know. Meanwhile, back at the Capitol building, Nix held her radio to her ear as a voice squawked out of the receiver. She let out a sigh of relief and declared, "Fumble recovered." Nix put her gun and radio away, then grabbed me by the arm. "Thank you for your help, lad," she said. "The president will be very happy when he hears he got his case back." I was still pretty shaken by everything that just happened, but after a moment I was able to spit out the words. "Why's that case so important? Did you really have to do all that?" "Never you mind about the case," Nix replied, sounding much friendlier now. "Let's get you back to your family, eh?" Jackie read the look on my face when I got back and knew things hadn't worked out. The two of us stayed together as the first family departed the luncheon hall and moved on to the final event of the day. The last part of the Inauguration Day festivities was the parade. I'm still not sure if this was a completely different parade or the tail end of the one we saw earlier. All I know was that this time we were actually in the parade. A line of big black cars pulled up to the eastern entrance of the U.S. Capitol. One of them was an SUV that looked far heavier than normal. It parked in front of us, and another Secret Service agent stepped out of a passenger door. "Welcome to Washington, Mr. President," he said to my dad. My family piled into the vehicle, and it pulled away. The motorcade joined the parade, which was now traveling northwest along Pennsylvania Avenue. Jackie and I looked left and right out the windows, trying to be the first to see the White House. Meanwhile, People were gathering along the sides of the road, cheering and yelling at the presidential car. "Walk! Walk! Walk!" "It's tradition," my dad said with one hand on the door handle, "for the president and his family to walk at least part of the parade route. Everyone ready? Okay, driver, stop." Mom, Dad, Jackie, and I all removed ourselves from the presidential limo and stood together in the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue for a moment. News reporters and photographers all gathered together and snapped several hundred pictures of us before we finally moved on. I held Jackie's hand, and Mom held mine. Dad led the way. I looked around for any familiar landmarks, but we were pretty deep inside the city. I couldn't even see the Washington Monument, which was pretty tall from what I can remember. Official records say my family started walking somewhere near the Ronald Reagan building, right in the heart of Washington. We walked together for about 3 blocks, waving to the crowds of cheering supporters the whole time. Finally, we took a left turn into a beautiful park filled with trees and statues of famous people. On our right, I saw a statue of Marquis de Lafayette. And to our left, I saw... "That's it!" I couldn't help but cry out. "I saw it first!" The White House loomed large at the center of the park. A large fountain partially obstructed our view of it, but that didn't temper my ability to appreciate such a beautiful sight. We passed through the north entrance and found several members of the White House staff waiting for us. The chief usher introduced himself and allowed various members of the White House staff to say hello. "Welcome to your new home, sir," the chief usher said. "You'll find the office of the president to have a much larger staff than you expected. Your predecessor hired many workers and officials to make your transition into office as smooth and simple. All of these people will work for you now, until you say otherwise." My dad shook hands with everyone, while Jackie and I hung back near Mom, taking a look around the big place nervously. We'd never been in a mansion before now, and we were both spooked by the fancy and expensive decorations all over the place. "Whoa," Jackie breathed. "Are we really gonna live here from now on?" "Certainly, ma'am," the chief usher replied with a smile. "We shall make this place your home for the next 4 years. Or 8, if the American people wish it."